So welcome everyone. This is our 13th class. I'm keeping track of the numbers because I have to put the session number on all the slides. Um, so welcome. Let's go ahead and start as we usually do with some prayers. So I've actually revised the prayer file a little bit to include the prayer for Rinpoche's swift return, so we don't have to go back and forth to another file. Let's just recite this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha once. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do, let me get my thing out of the way here. All right. The short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shod. Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu ji daki chanyen gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. All right, let's do a short meditation before we begin the class and just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath to calm the mind a bit. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation. So I'll ring the bell to start the meditation. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And we'll do this by briefly reflecting on last week's teaching. We're working with the topic of immutability, the ninth of the 10 presentations. And immutability is referring to the fact that while the mind does change and goes through a process of evolution to become the mind of a Buddha eventually, the emptiness of the mind does not change. The naturally abiding lineage, as it's called, which exists up until Buddhahood, the emptiness of the mind. That emptiness of the mind is the same emptiness of the nature truth body. The mind of a Buddha has that same qualifying emptiness. And throughout the entire path of development, we have this immutable nature, this unchanging nature. So once more, we can hold both of these concepts of the naturally abiding lineage, that emptiness of the mind that is unchanging, immutable, but also the developmental lineage. We haven't been talking about quite so much, but in this section in particular, we see how our minds do develop, beginning with the mind of an ordinary being, what we discussed last week as the impure state, the state of being contaminated completely by the delusions. But of course, this is temporary. It's not that the delusions are in the nature of the mind. Rather, they are there adventitiously. And so we can engage in the process of removing them gradually and eventually eliminating all obscurations completely and becoming a Buddha. And at the same time, developing all the qualities so we then can work tirelessly, effortlessly for the welfare of all beings. So again, set your motivation within this understanding. The immutable nature of our own minds, it is the same as the mind of an Arya Bodhisattva, the same as the mind of a Buddha. In terms of the emptiness of that mind, it is unchanging. Then also to hold the cognizance that our own minds and the minds of all beings can develop. We have that lineage, that Buddha nature as well. And we're here tonight to engage in these teachings so we can actualize Buddhahood eventually through this path of purification and the development of all the qualities. And hold that motivation of bodhicitta that strives to attain that goal. Not for ourselves alone, but for the sake of all beings, to accomplish their welfare through accomplishing our own. Okay, so again, we're working with this ninth presentation, immutability. Yes. Oh, okay. We're going to switch the microphones. That'll get rid of the buzzing that's here. I wondered what that was. Okay, is that better? Yeah. No buzzing here in the Galpa, so I don't know if you were hearing that there, but so there was one question from last week that Sean had when we talked about this analogy for the impure state and how things are built on ignorance, giving rise to the karma and delusions, and then the experiences of samsara, the aggregates and what have you. They were using the analogy of how you have the wind mandala, and upon that is the water mandala, and then from that comes the earth, and so on. And the question was raised as to where was fire, the fire element in all of this. And I went back to my Abhidharma teachings and didn't really find that question being answered. Of course, I don't know. I mean, maybe again, these are coming out of India, Vedic traditions in terms of they were talking about similar things. And maybe at that time they didn't have an awareness of how fire plays a role in the arisal of this planet, for example. I mean, we've got the molten core of the earth that's underneath all of this that gives rise to, things coming into existence. But again, it's not really mentioned, but I don't think that means that the fire element is absent in this whole process. It just means that this is the way that in observing our world, when they were putting together Buddhist cosmology, they simply had this concept of the wind giving rise to the waters and then the waters giving rise to the earth. But I can't speak to it any more than that. Because Buddhist cosmology, of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, at one of his lectures, he said, that if, and maybe he said this multiple times, if we find in modern science that things that are in Buddhist literature are, goes contrary to those, then we have to accept modern science. We have to accept what science shows. So Buddhist cosmology is very strange. Now, when this was brought up in Italy, in terms of this comment from His Holiness, my teacher said, well, be careful that you don't throw something out entirely, though, because you don't know whose karma allows you to see the world this way. Because again, in the Buddhist cosmology, they have Mount Meru at the center, and then they have the sun and the moon going around Mount Meru, which of course we know is not how the sun and the moon work. They don't go around a huge mountain, and that's why we experience at our particular location to Mount Meru, the sun rising and the moon setting and what have you. So he essentially said that if things in Buddhist teachings are contradicted by modern science, that we have to hold to modern science. But I do agree that if we don't know, maybe in a purified view, you would have a different experience of this world. Because again, that's something that we often talk about, is that our karma would definitely change. So Sean is saying, yeah, the sun would also be a fire element and would arise before water and earth. And of course, we know this, from, well, even, this planet must have been a ball of, molten stuff at some point in order to cool down into what it is now, so there's definitely fire involved in all of it we can see in modern science, but in the theories and views of what happened. But I wouldn't go, I just really can't talk much more about Buddhist cosmology because it is a strange animal. It's very hard to make sense out of all of it. So let's get back into our teachings at hand. And what I'm going to do is first go back to the chart, I think. I think that's a good place to start tonight. And so let me pull that up on the screen. Whoops, here. Again, we're working with this topic of immutability, and I just want to revisit the very first or the last column here on page 6 of these charts that you have. This is the set of the first set of charts that have to do with the 10 presentations. On the far right-hand side there, it says immutable does not mean that the mind does not change, but means that the nature of the mind does not change. The nature of the mind always remains as it is, whether the stains have not been removed at all, which is again the case of the first of the 3 states, the ordinary being, whether the stains have been partially removed, which is the second of the 3 states, and whether the stains have been completely removed, which would be the 3rd state, which again are the Buddhas, the Arya Buddhas, those beings who have done that work. So we went through the impure state, the ordinary beings last time. And again, that was covered on the screen there in those columns. And then it went on to the beginning of the next page. What we're going to go through tonight, and hopefully we'll get through even the next one, is the impure and pure state. And we're going to see right at the beginning of our commentary that it talks about how we're not talking about 2 different states here. We're talking about the combination of both of those. Arya Bodhisattvas in particular, though it would include other Aryas, who are pure in some regard, but also impure in another regard. And we're going to focus on the Bodhisattvas in particular. As you'll see on that left-hand side in that first column where there's writing the 5 types of Arya Bodhisattvas, 4 of them are going to be discussed in one section, and then the other one is going to be discussed in its own section. But we first have the Arya Bodhisattva. Again, this means a superior being, one who's had a direct realization of emptiness. The first would be the person who is on the first ground, who has entered into the Mahayana path of seeing. And then we would have those on the path of meditation, the rest of the grounds, until you get to the pure grounds, which begins at the 8th ground. So this would be the 1st or 2nd through 7th. There's different ways of interpreting that, but essentially it means all the other impure grounds before you've removed all of the afflictive obscurations. That would be the second one, the bodhisattva engaged in activities. And we'll look at the explanation of these titles shortly. The third, item C there in that column, is the bodhisattva non-returner. Non-returner here is not the same meaning as non-returner when we talk about stream enter, once returner, non-returner, foe destroyer, those ways of talking about the Arya Sangha. Rather, this is non-returner in terms of being irreversible, that you will definitely achieve buddhahood after attaining the eighth ground. So the eighth, ninth, and 10th grounds are the pure grounds. And I've mentioned this fact before, that without a doubt, all bodhisattvas become irreversible by the eighth ground, meaning they again will achieve buddhahood without a doubt. Again, I would think that everyone would eventually, even once you get to path of seeing, that you would progress on that way. But your irreversibility is determined by other factors, and you don't have it necessarily at the same time as other bodhisattvas. Some can get it on the path of preparation, some have it on the path of seeing, and then some have it all the way to the path of meditation, especially even the pure grounds here. So then D is the bodhisattva that's obstructed by one existence. This means the bodhisattva who has one more existence in samsara. Again, in samsara, kind of in quotes, because they're not really in samsara. They have eliminated all the afflictive obscuration, so they're not born in samsara through the force of karma and delusion. So they don't have that state of existence, but they have one more rebirth in which they will accumulate all the final merit that is required and achieve the realizations, and then eventually attain Buddhahood. So they've got one, this is prior to that, the penultimate life, before that, and then you have the bodhisattva in their last life. That's the next category that, again, it stands on its own. So you have these 5 types of Arya bodhisattvas that are going to be discussed. Then what we see in terms of these, that we have the immutable nature of the Tathagata essence in that middle column there, the unchanging nature of Buddha, of the emptiness of the mind, that's during the pure and impure state. The bodhisattvas on the first bodhisattva ground, bodhisattvas on, again, the 2nd through 7th, bodhisattvas on the 8th, 9th, and then 10th grounds. Though some presentations say actually that the 8th, 9th, and 10th would be included in that. And then definitely by the time you get to the number 4 there, you're on the 10th ground without a doubt. And then the description there says Arya bodhisattvas are called pure from the first ground onwards because they have ceased taking birth under the power of karma and afflictions through having directly realized suchness. And this is where they have achieved that state because of their bodhicitta, together with their realization of emptiness. They have eliminated the sort of cycle of rebirth through the force of the general factors that cause one to take rebirth, such as what are laid out in the 12 links of dependent origination. Instead, the bodhisattvas take rebirth by compassion. And that's the second part of this. It says, but they are called impure until the Buddha ground, in terms of their taking birth with a mental body by the force of latencies of ignorance and uncontaminated karma, and by the force of their compassion and prayers. Remember, we've talked about this mental body thing, that bodhisattvas have a mental body at a certain stage where they are able to abide in that, but that goes through a process of death and you achieve another rebirth. It doesn't do it through the force of karma and delusions in terms of how normal rebirth takes place, because that's all through contaminated rebirth, contaminated karma. Rather, you take rebirth through the force of uncontaminated karma. We'll talk about that more in this section as well. So we're not going to go through, I don't know that I want to go through this next column quite yet. Let me go to the commentary by Geshe Loden first. Actually, I think it'd be better to go to this. We'll go to the text. We're on page 143 of Gyaltsep Je's commentary. And this is the entire section that encompasses this immutable during what's called here the impure and pure state. Oops, sorry, somehow I hit the button there. Again, we're going to get a description of that right away in terms of this link. This begins, in the pure and impure state, it is unchanging. Pure and impure does not indicate two separate states. It means that the bodhisattva state itself at this point is pure or impure, depending on particular aspects. It is purified of birth, etc., created through the force of karma and afflictions. And it is an impure state because of displaying birth and so on through the force of compassion. So it's like the bodhisattva is still caught up in a process of being involved in samsara in terms of taking rebirth and being among beings and what have you. That's the impurity. But they no longer do that through karma and afflictions like ordinary beings do. That's the purity. So then it says, alternatively, the extinction of birth through the force of karma and afflictions is a pure state when compared to ordinary beings, and an impurity when compared to a Buddha. So we actually have kind of two ways of looking at this. One has to do with the state of the bodhisattva themselves in terms of they purified all the causes of taking rebirth through the force of karma and afflictions, but they also are impure because they're still taking rebirth through the force of their compassion for beings. But the other one looks at it from the point of view of who you're comparing them to. If you compare these impure, pure bodhisattvas, Arya bodhisattvas, to ordinary beings, they're purified because they no longer have the force of karma and afflictions propelling them through existence. But when you compare them to Buddhas, they're still impure because they still have levels of obscuration, whether it be still afflictive obscurations if they're prior to the eighth ground, or both um, uh, just knowledge obscurations if you're on the pure grounds. You have both afflictions if you're prior to the eighth ground. So again, this is what we're going to be examining in more detail, is the impure and pure states and the various levels of bodhisattvas that are abiding in these in this category. So let's go through the short presentation, verse 65. The Arya Bodhisattvas, remember at the beginning of this whole section, we had like there's going to be one root like verse, and then there's going to be several commentary verses. So this is the one that is the root verse. It gives the kind of main explanation of what this section is about. The Arya Bodhisattvas, freed from the sufferings of aging, sickness, and death, again, the main things that we all go through from life to life, and realizing the basic elements nature as thusness, again, they have realized emptiness directly, are liberated from the misery of rebirth and so forth. Again, rebirth through the force of karma and afflictions. But, so that first part was all about the purified component, but the impure part, having realized the basic elements nature, the intelligent ones display birth in order to cultivate compassion. Out of their compassion for others, they continue to take rebirth to continue to work on their own welfare as well as the welfare of others. So we're going to see this again being explained in more detail in regard to the various bodhisattvas. But the commentary here says the wise Arya bodhisattvas are liberated from birth, death, illness, and old age created through the force of karma and affliction because, distinguished by their great deeds, they have directly realized the true nature of this basic element. They have realized the emptiness of the mind. They have realized the emptiness of Buddha nature, realized all of emptiness. When you realize emptiness directly in regard to one phenomenon, you have realized emptiness in regard to all phenomena because it's the same emptiness. Even though the variety of phenomena are diverse, you still have an individual nature. Again, that's the whole point of this immutability of the nature. Goes on to say, although they are freed from the misery of birth and so forth, produced by karma and affliction, they focus on sentient beings and devote. Remember that word devote. We're going to see a comment in just a minute or so about that. They devote themselves to taking birth in samsara in order to develop their compassion. The reason or cause of this is their direct realization of the nature of the basic element, the direct realization of emptiness, and their great compassion. So once more, through the force of both wisdom and compassion, they are then able to do this. Unlike Arya hearers or solitary realizers who don't do that, they're still under the control of karma and afflictions until they become foe destroyers. But bodhisattvas can do this due to their great compassion, which of course is embodied in their bodhicitta. So then this is the comment where he kind of talks about that, where it says devote themselves to taking birth. It says, alternatively, the verse could mean that although freed from the kind of birth that occurs in samsara by the force of karma and affliction, they see the sufferings of birth in others. In other words, they see that others are under the control of karma and affliction still. And with that reason or cause, these intelligent bodhisattvas develop compassion for sentient beings and display birth in samsara, rather than devote themselves to taking birth. There's a footnote on that at the bottom. It says, although many verses in this work are open to interpretation, Gyaltsab Je is probably thinking that the word sen, to devote, might be a misspelling of ten, to display. So you notice it's got a different vowel sound there, the E versus the A. They're usually pronounced very similarly, but nonetheless, what we essentially have then is a slight change in meaning, but it kind of makes some sense, right? To display showing rebirth. Because the bodhisattvas aren't really suffering from taking rebirth. They have a mind that has already been liberated from some of that, even though they haven't attained full liberation from the afflictive obscurations. The mind of a bodhisattva is completely changed after that initial direct realization of emptiness when they become an Arya. And again, due to their great compassion, their bodhicitta, they continue to take rebirth. So again, to finish off this commentary in that section, it just says the first 2.5 lines of the verse express the pure aspect, and the remaining 1.5 lines express the impure. And you'd have to know the Tibetan to know that. It essentially is the first 3 lines of the verse in our English, and then the last line in terms of the impure. The first 3 are pure. So now we get an extensive explanation, which again is more of a commentary. And what I might do here is pull up the chart that I put together that I don't know how helpful it is. I think in some ways I find it useful to go back to it when I'm going through and reviewing the material for teaching it, is to kind of take a look at how these all fit together. So in the extensive explanation, what you see on the screen there is we have essentially 2 main topics. Immutability during the pure and impure states defined on the basis of birth, again, of the bodhisattva's birth. They're no longer taking rebirth through the force of karma and afflictions, therefore they're pure, but they are taking rebirth through the force of great compassion, and therefore, in that regard, they are impure. But then number 2 is immutability during the pure and impure states defined on the basis of Buddha and ordinary beings. It's the same bodhisattva being both pure and impure, but here their purity is compared to ordinary beings, but their impurity is compared to Buddhas. All right, which I just explained a short while ago. But then we see again, when we get into that explanation of compared to Buddhas, we go through the various levels of the bodhisattvas that were on the chart, and we look at how they compare in terms of their own realizations and where they're at in the path with the Buddhas and so on, and what they have attained, but of course what they haven't attained yet due to the fact that they haven't attained Buddhahood yet. And then eventually we get to the second part of that, which is the pure and impure qualities of the last life bodhisattva that's kind of towards the bottom there. That's the essence of this section. There's really not a whole lot of complicated things about it, but it does get into a little bit more detail in terms of describing and expressing what's going on at these various levels of development. So we get here again, those 2 sections that we're going to be looking at in more detail. Let's go down to, or next to the next page, 144. We have immutability during the pure and impure states defined on the basis of birth. And there are a couple of verses for this. First, verse 66, in terms of talking about the features of the pure state. Arya bodhisattvas have eradicated the sufferings of death, sickness, and old age from the root. They are free from the sufferings of samsara because they are not reborn by the force of karma and afflictions. So the Arya Bodhisattvas, having completely left behind the sufferings of death, illness, old age brought on by karma and affliction, are free from the sufferings of samsara because they no longer take birth through the power of karma and affliction. Hinayana Arya practitioners directly perceive emptiness as well. I mean, right, they have that realization. They're Aryas. They have a superior realization. But because their minds are not held by the special method aspect, they still take birth through the force of karma and affliction. However, the Arya Bodhisattva does not take that kind of birth. So then, let's go through this, and then I'll go to Geshe Lodin's commentary. I'm going to change it up a little bit tonight. It may be wondered, later on the commentary talks of deliberately taking birth in samsara, and the commentary to the Ornament for Clear Realization, again also by Maitreya, talks of abandoning those seeds of ignorance and views, but not the contaminations of the realm of desire and samsara, because these beings deliberately take birth in samsara. So he's kind of citing, this objector is citing some various passages that seem to say that that somehow there's still rebirth happening through the force of these contaminations, and it's contaminated karma and afflictions that are behind it. It says, this means that the contaminations of the realm of desire and samsara are causes for birth for the bodhisattvas. Doesn't this contradict with the above that you just explained? And that seems to be coming from Arya Sangha's commentary, because it's all in boldface. Let's look at what Gyaltsepje's reply to that is. What these references mean is that afflicted ignorance, the view of the transitory collection, which is the view of a self of persons, the person to inherently exist, extreme views, which are again nihilistic views or permanent views, and so forth, are in no way requirements for the fulfillment of the welfare of oneself or the welfare of others, right? You don't have to hold on to those to achieve those. In fact, you have to get rid of those without a doubt. And so even the bodhisattvas concentrate on abandoning them. It's not to say that bodhisattvas, just have this mind that is only looking at the knowledge obstructions and wanting to become a Buddha and disregarding the things that are afflictions causing one to be bound up in samsara that are essentially the obscurations to liberation. They do have to abandon them as well. The next sentence says, the contaminations of the realm of desire and samsara are not necessary causes for birth, though, because birth occurs here through the force of compassion. And in the Arya Bodhisattvas at the point of death, the thought, I will not exist, and the subsequent fear, which leads to a grasping of contaminated aggregates and so forth, is not there. So what happens for ordinary beings is when you get to that place, or even Aryas who are not free of this level of suffering, such as Arya, hearer Aryas and solitary realizer Aryas, is that when you get to the end of this life, there is a strong grasping at existence. Remember, if you've studied the 12 links of dependent arising, this is the 9th link. You first have craving at the 8th link, and then the 9th link is a heightened form of attachment that we call grasping, and it's specifically grasping at existence because you fear you're going out of existence as you die. Well, that ripens the karmic seed in the 10th link that becomes the propelling cause for your next rebirth. So it says here, when they take birth through the force of compassion, though, these bodhisattvas, there may well be manifest contamination, such as the contamination of the realm of desire when they take birth as universal emperors and so forth to become children of the Mahayana family, and contamination of samsara when they take birth in the form realms and so forth through the powers of prayer. But like poison neutralized by mantra or medicine, they do not develop the faults of the afflictions. So this is kind of the quite magic of the bodhisattvas. It's what they have attained in terms of the Arya bodhisattvas have a realization that disempowers the technique, the methodology of taking rebirth through the force of karma and delusions, so that they don't experience any of the suffering effects of that, but they still have the mechanism in place to do that through the force of their compassion. So it's, again, speaking to both the pure and impure aspects of these Arya bodhisattvas. Let's look at this last part of this, and then we'll go to the slides from Geshe Loden. The definition of affliction is a state of mind that greatly disturbs the continuum of the mind. In that sense, nirvana can be said to be the complete pacification of the continuum of the mind, whereas the opposite, non-pacification, is the truth of suffering, and its creator is the afflictions. And for ordinary beings, this is how we talk about it, right? The afflictions in the continuum of the Arya Bodhisattva, though, can be called afflictions, but they do not fulfill the criteria mentioned above. Why? Because they don't disturb the continuum of the mind. They're disempowered through the realization of emptiness by that Arya Bodhisattva. So again, it's not to say that there still aren't things that are happening to those bodhisattvas, that things will still happen to them in terms of harm being inflicted on them, what have you, but they don't experience that suffering. They're not under the control of those factors in terms of taking rebirth and experiencing aging, sickness, death, what have you. They still go through the process of it, but it's no longer, again, empowered by karma and delusions as it was before. We're going to skip that last little part and go on to the next one when we come back. Let me take it off screen here and go to the slides. We'll get those started. Again, I did have some of these slides in last week's set that you got, so some of them are repeated because I thought maybe I'd get farther than I did. But in terms of immutability, the verses that Geshe Loden comments on are only a handful of these. And this is the end of his presentation of immutability. He doesn't do anything about immutability during the pure state, which is the third of these three states. So this verse, 65, that we just looked at, refers to a superior bodhisattva. Due to her realization of the natural potential or suchness, conjoined with the special method of bodhicitta, she is free from samsaric birth, death, sickness, and aging. However, such beings still take rebirth in samsara in order to benefit others and to complete their accumulations of merit and wisdom. We're going to look at shortly the 8 different reasons why bodhisattvas take rebirth. That's one of the little sections that I am going to cover in a whole bunch of pages that I'm going to skip. But their births, though, are not conditioned by afflicted karma and delusion, as in the case of ordinary beings. A superior bodhisattva takes rebirth through the causes of her direct realization of suchness and through having generated great compassion for living beings, for all living beings. So again, there's 2 factors that allow the bodhisattvas to do this. So prior to achieving your direct realization, and when you're on the path of preparation, and you have not yet realized emptiness directly, you cannot do this. You cannot control your rebirth. Once you have hit the path of seeing and beyond, due to the great compassion that has been generated, that is the essence of your bodhicitta, together with the direct realization of suchness, you have the factors in place to be able to do that. Such a bodhisattva is referred to as being both pure and impure. She is pure in being free from the bondage of samsaric birth, sickness, aging, and death. The bodhisattva is called impure because she nonetheless shows the actions of birth, sickness, aging, and death within samsara, even though this is entirely due to compassion, right? The compassion for other beings that you continue to be involved in the world. Of course, it's, again, as we're going to see, for both the cause of achieving your own welfare and others, because they're hand in hand. How do you develop your own welfare? Through practicing the perfections, for example, and being among other beings where you can practice generosity and patience and so on. Though they are not bound to samsara through delusion and afflicted karma, superior bodhisattvas see the suffering, sickness, aging, and so on of other beings. And this stimulates their compassion. That's why, again, this idea of it causes them to display rebirth rather than devote themselves to, rebirth in samsara or to other beings. It is through this compassion that superior bodhisattvas show the action of taking rebirth in the place of samsara. And they're technically, they've still got the causes and conditions that would lead them to rebirth in samsara, but they're disempowered. They don't, those who are on the impure ground still have the afflictive obscurations. Once you become a pure bodhisattva at the 8th ground and above, then obviously you don't have those factors even in your mind, in your mental continuum. But that goes on then to 66. So let's stop it here and go back to our commentary. So again, Geshe Loden doesn't say anything all that revolutionary, different than what we looked at. It's just kind of a nice summary of what was in that section. Now we look at the headline for this one in terms of the outline is how the nature of the impure state is characterized by pure and impure causes. So again, both of these causes, one that is pure and others that are impure, that they are together in allowing the bodhisattva to do this. So this says first, because of the method aspect, which again is the great compassion, bodhicitta, and secondly, the direct realization of the basic element, the wisdom aspect, just as it is, seeing emptiness just as it is directly, they are beyond birth and so forth. Having the essence of compassion, they manifest death, sickness, and old age. Distinguished by a vast method aspect, and because they directly perceive the basic element exactly as it is, they pass beyond birth, etc., brought on by the force of karma and affliction. However, by the force of prayer and by their innate natures of compassion, they show birth, death, old age, and sickness. So actually, I could have shared more of Geshe Loden's because I forgot we had just covered 66. But let's go back and we'll go through 66 and 67. And as I said, that's all that Geshe Loden talks about, is this whole first section about compared to on the basis of birth, how you can see both pure and impure states involved with this bodhisattva. So he says, a superior bodhisattva does not have the sufferings of samsara because he has abandoned the experiences of birth, sickness, aging, and death that arise due to karma and delusions. A superior bodhisattva no longer takes birth under the influence of karma and delusions. Again, that's the purity side of it. In contrast, however, a superior hearer or solitary realizer can still take rebirth under the influence of karma and delusion. Because though they have the wisdom which directly perceives emptiness, again, just like the Arya Bodhisattva, this wisdom is not conjoined with the special method of bodhicitta. So again, we see that sort of power of bodhicitta to allow one to do that together with the realization of emptiness. Continuing on verse 66, he says, a first ground bodhisattva who has not previously completed the Hinayana path. This is an important qualifier if you were doing debate, because you can have a first ground bodhisattva who did complete the Hinayana path, who became a foe destroyer, who checked out of samsara in a mental body, and then was beckoned back into the Mahayana and became a first ground bodhisattva on the basis of the accumulation of merit, not on the basis of a direct realization of emptiness, because they've already removed the afflictive obscurations. Anyway, that first ground bodhisattva still has delusions, but these delusions are unable to affect him. Due to the power of his bodhicitta and wisdom, he can completely control the delusions, just as a powerful antidote can overcome the effect of any poison that one may have eaten. So this is the power, again, of these two things combined together, not just the wisdom of emptiness, but the bodhicitta compelled by great compassion. Though we may refer to the delusions within the continuum of a superior, the connotation of the delusions afflicting the mind does not apply, again, like we saw in that earlier commentary. This is because the superior bodhisattva's bodhicitta and wisdom completely control the effect of the delusions, and they are unable to harm him. You know, again, it's like a disempowering, even though you still have those factors there. You know, the mechanism by which they would give rise to any disturbance in the mind is no longer there. Now, at verse 67 that we just talked about, which has to do with these two causes, it says, because they directly perceive the immaculate suchness of Buddha potential and are empowered by the special method of bodhicitta, both of those causes, superior bodhisattvas have passed beyond rebirth under the influence of karma and delusions. However, they continue to display birth, death, aging, sickness, and so on within samsara due to their compassionate nature and, again, the power of their prayers. Okay, so let me hold it there because I'll come back to that for a few comments from Geshe Jean-Paul Gyaltsen. Let's go then to our commentary where we're essentially going to, as I said, skip over the more extensive part of this. There's a short presentation that takes place. I'm going to read that, but then the rest of this in terms of the extensive explanation is just really, it kind of gets into all these debates and the sutra, scripture references. I'm only going to cover one little part of that. So let's conclude this verse by reading the short presentation. The bodhisattvas, with their root virtue of compassion, again, and the force of prayer, connect everywhere to the three realms. Deliberately and with control over birth, these lines from Sangha teach the unpurified nature. However, the phenomena of birth and so on, created by the relevant causes, karma and affliction, are not there because they have truly seen exactly as it is, the basic element as not born and not appearing. So this, again, is just a short commentary on a Sangha's commentary, just reiterating these two main causes, the virtue of compassion and prayer and aspiration to continue to benefit others that causes one to take rebirth. That's the impure aspect. And then the pure aspect is through having realized emptiness directly, having seen the basic element. So again, I'm going to skip from here essentially to page 146, but on the next page, page 140, no, it goes beyond 146, sorry. I'm going to skip from there. I had it marked wrong. It's all the way up to page 150 at the bottom. But what I want to talk about before we go there, and I just really feel like this whole other commentary, other than this first little section, is kind of an interesting thing to at least go over. Most of it goes into, again, a lot of scripture references, and it just becomes very convoluted. And I don't know that there's much value in going through all of that. And again, I'm trying to not get lost in the weeds, as they might say. So let's just look at this one section, though, that has to do with recognizing the causes of taking birth in samsara. I think this is really quite interesting because, we often just say, well, bodhisattvas take rebirth through the force of great compassion, but for what reason? I mean, why do bodhisattvas take rebirth? Just out of compassion, well, that's not giving you enough to work with, right? So in this section of Asanga's commentary that starts with the line, the bodhisattvas abiding in this state, ... The sutra lists 8 categories of different kind of Again, you might even have all of these purposes to some degree, but the bodhisattva is wanting to accomplish all of these things, right? First, taking birth in order to complete one's collection of merit. Recall that from that wonderful chart that I put on before, let me click on it again. We have three great countless eons of merit that needs to be accumulated. The first is, of course, through the ordinary bodhisattva part of the path, the paths of accumulation and preparation. So we aren't talking about that merit, because that merit is accumulated while you're still not an Arya. But then in terms of the second and the third, you still need to accumulate a great amount of merit in order to progress. Remember that the merit is kind of like the gas in the tank that helps you to get there. The realization of emptiness takes you from ground to ground and all the way up through to buddhahood. But nonetheless, if you don't have the requisite merit, that will be ineffective. You won't be able to actually remove the next layer of obscuration. So this is one of the reasons why bodhisattvas take rebirth in samsara, is in order to fulfill that requisite amount of merit. So the second one is for the purpose of caring for other sentient beings. Obviously, the bodhisattvas do want to attend to the suffering of beings. And so if there are suffering beings, then they will appear in the world to be able to attend to them, to care for them, and so on. Third is motivated by faith in the conqueror. And it's actually said that, for example, at the time of Buddha Shakyamuni, there were many Arya bodhisattvas who took rebirth in the retinue of the Buddha so that they could then benefit from the direct words of this supreme emanation body of this Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, who was appearing in our world. And so you do that in order to be able, because you've got some connection in previous lives, in order to continue to benefit from the teachings of that being. So again, it says motivated by faith in the conqueror to meet the Buddha in another body. So you've got a connection to that Buddha. You want to go to wherever that Buddha is manifesting. Number 4, so as not to become discouraged in the practice of caring for disciples. Geshe Tenzin Temple, when he talks about this, he says, in general, it's not easy to take care of many disciples, but requires patience and enthusiasm. So, you might deliberately take rebirth in places where, you deal with that challenge of people who are a bit stubborn and hard to get their minds to move in a particular direction, so that you don't lose your desire to benefit them, your strong effort and enthusiasm to practice. All right. Number 5, to preserve the holy Dharma of the conquerors. It's often said that some of these great beings who appeared in our world, like Nagarjuna and what have you, may have been these high-level bodhisattvas who came into our world to be able to preserve the Dharma, to be able to assure that the Dharma of Buddha Shakyamuni didn't disappear and was actually reinvigorated through the Mahayana teachings and what have you. All of the Sanskrit sutras that came from Nagarjuna's presence. Other beings like Chandrakirti, Shantideva, Atisha might also be high-level bodhisattvas who are about doing that, right? Atisha is amazing. He's the one who brought this whole corpus of teachings out of India, where the Dharma was heading into decline and then eventually disappearing completely, pretty much, from India, into Tibet, where it was held as this sacred jewel in the land of snows for many, many centuries. So 6, to generate enthusiasm in working for the welfare of others. Here too, you want to be able to take joy in benefiting others, and because sentient beings here too might be a bit difficult, might be hard to please. You do want to generate fortitude that you can continue to have that enthusiasm and joy in working for the welfare of other beings. 7, for the state of mind that works for the bodhisattva conduct and for the basis of the conduct, the bodhicitta. So if you were to be reborn, for example, in a pure land, in like Sukhavati or something, well, those are realms where they don't have manifest suffering, and you might find it harder to develop your compassionate motivation and feed into your bodhicitta and strengthen it, because you're not witnessing the suffering of beings at a gross level. Sure, the beings there still have, other forms of dukkha, but nonetheless, you want to be often in places where your bodhisattva conduct and development of bodhicitta will be strengthened by the environment that you're in. And then 8th, for the practice of the perfections motivated by that state of mind. There are some realms where it would be hard to practice these various perfections. You have to take rebirth in a situation where you can engage in them You need to have people around you who make you angry, for example, to practice patience. If you don't have that, then again, you might have some problems. Let's go back to the chart, and we did go through now 68. So let's look at the qualities that accomplish their own. Oh no, I'm sorry. We haven't gone through 68 yet, have we? No, we didn't. We went through 67. Isn't that where we were? Yeah, 67. All right, let's go forward, and then again, we're going to go to page 150 towards the bottom, and it's just the beginning of the next section. That's the only bit of that whole last several pages that I really want to cover. When we get to this next section on the bottom of 150, we're now getting into the immutability during the pure and impure states defined on the basis of Buddha and ordinary beings. So remember, there were these two main outlines here. This is the second one. The first one was just the rebirth of the Bodhisattva, looking at pure in one regard, impure in another regard. Here we're looking at whether we are comparing them to Buddhas or ordinary beings. Purified in regard to ordinary beings, impure in regard to Buddhas. So the link at the bottom of the page, there is another meaning to the verse, previously explained as a root-like verse. This is again verse 65 that we started with. And that's what we're going to get into, is that other meaning, that other way of looking at impure and pure. And this is once more divided, as I mentioned earlier, when we looked at that chart of the outline headings, into the pure and impure qualities of the four bodhisattvas that are all prior to the last life, and then the pure and impure qualities of the bodhisattva that's in their last life. So the first 9 verses, 68 through 76, explain the pure qualities. The 10th explains impurity compared to a Buddha. Okay? So let's look at the pure and impure qualities of 4 bodhisattvas. So to do this, I am going to first go to the commentary by Geshe Jompo Gyaltsen that I put into the slides. It just gives another way of looking at this. Again, when I went through the chart, when we looked at that column that defined these, it referred to them in a particular way. There's slight differences, but just know that that's part of commentaries, is that people will enumerate them in different ways depending upon their view of this. There's no absolute right or wrong answer to these. This refers to the pure and impure states with 5 different levels of Arya Bodhisattvas. In this section that we are about to go into, 4 are enumerated. But as I said earlier, there's a 5th one that is mentioned later on. That's the Bodhisattva that is in their last life in samsara, right? 1 is qualities of those who develop ultimate bodhicitta first. That refers to the bodhisattvas with the realization of emptiness on the first bhumi, the first ground, all right? Ultimate bodhicitta is the wisdom directly realizing emptiness. This is another name for that wisdom realizing emptiness. We often talk about conventional bodhicitta, which is what we normally talk about as bodhicitta, the mind aspiring to become a Buddha for the sake of others. Ultimate bodhicitta is when you have a mind supported by bodhicitta that is directly realizing emptiness. So here, ultimate bodhicitta first means on the first bhumi. Doesn't mean you realize ultimate bodhicitta first and then you realize something else. It means we're talking about the first realization of ultimate bodhicitta. So that's the delineation of who is being discussed in that section. Number 2 are qualities of those engaged in activities. This refers to the bodhisattvas that are engaged in activities on the impure grounds, the impure bhumis. Which, again, it makes some sense to say that this includes the 1st to the 7th, even though we just talked about the 1st. We delineated them separately because I think the text wants to emphasize that even at the first ground, the first bhumi, you already have this embodiment of purity and then impurity and so on. But it's really, again, we could talk about and extend this second category to be the 1st to the 7th, though, again, some texts will present it as the second bhumi to the 7th. Remember, this is the territory in which the bodhisattva will be abandoning the, once you enter into the second ground, you've begun the abandoning of the innate afflictive obscurations. And then you go on to abandon the innate, or it was really not innate and acquired, there's only innate knowledge obscurations on the pure grounds, the pure bhumis, and that's the next categories. The qualities of the non-returners refers to the bodhisattvas from the 8th bhumi up to the 10th bhumi. Now, again, some people will include the 10th bhumi. I think given in our text, we say that there's no doubt that it includes the other 2, the 9th and the 10th, even though we mainly talk about 8th ground bodhisattvas in that section. And then number 4 are qualities of those obstructed by one life, refers to the bodhisattva on the 10th bhumi who will achieve complete enlightenment in his or her next life. As far as I recall, a bodhisattva on the 10th bhumi, at the beginning of the 10th bhumi, for example, is not necessarily going to achieve enlightenment in the life after the next. This is kind of strange the way it says this, because it's not technically the way that we interpret it. Obstructed by one life means that they have one more life. Oh, that's right. Oh, that's how it is. I'm sorry. Yeah, one more life, which would be the next life. And that next life is when they would attain it. Whereas the final one, the 5th one that has its own section, is the bodhisattva who will attain it in that life, which again would be a 10th grounder. I don't recall, but I will have to go back and check that. I meant to check that before tonight to see if all 10th grounders are only obstructed by one life or are in the last category and they will achieve it in that life. I don't think that's the case. I think, again, on the 10th ground, you could still have a number of lifetimes, but I'll have to check that. The 5th category, he says, that we will see later in verses 76 and 77 is the perfected bodhisattvas, who will achieve enlightenment in that very life. In our text, we see them referred to as last life bodhisattvas. These are the different levels of Arya bodhisattvas that are explained here. Again, this 5th category is most definitely a 10th ground bodhisattva then as well. The previous one was when they had one life remaining, and this one is when they are going to achieve it in that life. All right. Now let's go through the text and see what it has to say about these various bodhisattvas. Okay, so first, the qualities of those who develop ultimate bodhicitta first. Verse 68. Even though the children of conquerors realize the immutable nature, they are seen by those who are blinded by ignorance as taking rebirth and so forth. This is truly wonderful. So again, even though they've attained that purity, they still have the impurity of taking rebirth to display rebirth to sentient beings. The children of the conquerors, again, that's a moniker for all bodhisattvas, but it says here they first develop the mind that passes beyond the world. That's what happens when you enter into the path of seeing, and they become you develop a supramundane wisdom, and you move to the first level, in the first ground or bhumi, where they perceive directly the immutable reality. Although they are free from the troubles of samsara and from birth and death caused by karma and affliction, nevertheless, by the power of compassion and prayer, and in the manner of those blinded by afflicted ignorance, they are born, become sick, grow old, and die. That this is seen directly, even by those blind with ignorance, is truly extraordinary and wonderful. What's interesting is this section, you'll notice that this first bodhisattva is divided into the qualities of the accomplishment of one's own welfare, which is the verse we just read, and then others' welfare. Geshe Jangpo Yeltsin said that he actually thinks this one is accomplishing others' welfare as well. But once more, just remember that these two things are caught up together, right? While you are accomplishing the welfare of others, you are accomplishing your own welfare. Because if you are engaged in benefiting beings in any of those ways that we talked about, that bodhisattvas are taking rebirth, to practice the perfections, to come to the welfare of other beings that are suffering and so on, you are always involved in accumulating merit and creating the causes and conditions for your attainment of buddhahood. So I don't think we need to be too much of a stickler on it and say it's one or the other. It's both in a sense. But this verse is primarily indicating that we're taking rebirth through the force of karma and able to benefit others in that way. I'm sorry, through the force of compassion, not by karma and affliction, and benefiting others in that way. And it says, alternatively, the verse teaches the qualities of great compassion, which when compared to those of the Buddha are impure. Right, because we're in that section of comparing ourselves to ordinary beings. We're Arya Bodhisattva, comparing and seeing that you're purified in relation to them because they have not yet attained that realization. And then you're impure in regard to a Buddha, because the great compassion of these Arya Bodhisattvas is nothing compared to the great compassion of a Buddha. So now the second part of this, the qualities for the accomplishment of others' welfare, verse 69. Those who have attained the domain of Aryas display themselves in the domain of the childish. This is the method of those friends of migrators and supreme compassion. So with the attainment of the domain of the Arya, becoming, a superior being, which refers to the total severance of the sufferings of birth, death, etc., again, because of the combination of not just that realization of emptiness, but also great compassion and bodhicitta. The first level bodhisattva, motivated by compassion, shows birth and so forth within the domain of ordinary beings. Therefore, they are friends to sentient beings, in possession of the best methods and of great compassion. So again, this is how bodhisattvas, even at the first ground, already have both of these aspects. All right. Let's go to our chart and we look at that section that pertained to that. Bodhisattvas on the first ground, they have qualities that accomplish their own welfare, having perceived suchness directly and being endowed with special method. They are free from the sufferings of samsara, such as birth and death, under the power of karma and afflictions. So again, we could say that has achieved their own welfare because they're no longer doing that through the force of karma and afflictions. But nonetheless, our text also talked about them taking rebirth through compassion, but that's mainly what we were talking about in the second part, qualities that accomplish their others' welfare, and that's verse 69. Out of their compassion and prayers, they show birth and death in samsara. So now we go on to the second of these, those engaged in activities, and this again pertains to those on the impure grounds. So we see two sections for this as well, untainted, although dwelling in the world, and then correlating the example with the meaning. So verse 70 starts this. It says, although gone beyond all worlds, they do not depart from the world. So again, they've developed that supramundane wisdom, and with bodhicitta, they no longer are compelled to take rebirth through karma and delusions, but they don't depart from the world. They continue to manifest in the world. For the sake of the world, they engage in the world without being affected by its defilements. They continue to take rebirth, displaying that to sentient beings. Although bodhisattvas from the second to the seventh level have passed beyond the worlds of ordinary beings and hearers and solitary realizers, they remain in the world and do not move away from taking birth and so on. Although they remain in the world, they stay and act in the world for the sake of those in the world and are untainted by its contaminations, such as being controlled by afflictions, oppressed by the troubles of suffering and the causes of suffering, and being unable to work for the welfare of others, etc. Okay. Then correlating the example with the meaning, they have an example that's being given here for these beings. Just as a lotus growing in water is unsullied by impurities in the water, as lotuses grow in the very muddy, murky parts of the pond, that kind of the stem of the lotus rises far above so that the lotus itself, when it unfolds, is unsullied by the mud. In the same way, they are born in the world, but are not sullied by worldly dharmas. We often use the lotus for a number of different things to refer to, but it has that idea of purity that arises from in the midst of impurity. Kind of like we need the gunk, the garbage of samsara in order to accomplish the purity, to establish the purity. And in this case, it's the purity being there in the midst of all of the mud and suffering of sentient beings, but no longer experiencing it. Nonetheless, you're still in the muddy pond with the other beings so that you can benefit them. Just as a lotus born in water is unsullied by any contamination in the water, again, mud and so on, so these bodhisattvas who are engaged in their activities, although they are born in the world, are not sullied by worldly dharmas because they are liberated from birth and death, brought on by karma and affliction, and have the complete mastery to decide on their births. Geshe Jumpo Gyaltsen said that if in terms of being engaged in activity, it includes first ground bodhisattvas, and they have the same qualities. They would fall into the same description. They just, again, have their separate category because they wanted, I think, to emphasize that even at that first level, the first ground, you do have both aspects of purity and impurity present. Okay, now we go on to the non-returners. And as I mentioned earlier, this is meaning the irreversible beings, not non-returners in the way that we often talk about it in relation to those on the Hinayana path. Accomplishing tasks, their mind constantly blazes like fire. They permanently abide in equipoise within the concentration of the absorption of pacification. So again, these are the bodhisattvas who are on the pure grounds now. They have completely removed all of the afflictive obscurations. and they have developed their wisdom of emptiness to the point where they can remain in meditative equipoise frequently, but they still are blocked to having that meditative equipoise be simultaneous with a engagement in conventional affairs in the world. It's not until you become a Buddha where you have that. So they've got a different way that we talk about their impurity. In their work for the welfare of sentient beings, Gyaltsab Je says, the minds of the complete non-returner bodhisattvas on the 8th level constantly blaze like fire. Again, they're talking about the 8th level, but as we see, we can include the other pure grounds in this. These two lines, the first two lines, refer to the perfect accumulation for the sake of others. Having abandoned forever all affliction, they dwell constantly in the meditative stabilization and the meditative absorption of the total pacification of all suffering and striving. This is because they have attained complete mastery over non-conceptual exalted wisdom. This is kind of an interesting comment. Let me read the rest of this page, and then I'll share something with you from the book on Buddha nature from the Kagyu tradition. On the comment there to be kind of interesting. The next paragraph, although they have the ability to actualize the nirvana that is the pacification of the all-pervading suffering, right, because they've completely abandoned the afflictive obscurations, they have destroyed any possibility of the kind of mind arising that strives for liberation solely for their own welfare. One way you can in some traditions you talk about the pure grounds, is that they also are free of any slight trace of self-charity. So there's like no chance that the bodhisattvas at this level would ever revert to liberation. You know, it would seem like it'd be impossible even prior to that, but nonetheless, they definitely have removed anything that would be a stain that would cause any thinking about going into the state of nirvana or liberation for oneself alone. They have attained, therefore, the level of the complete non-returner, having, again, the complete irreversible being. Having achieved the yoga of the equality of samsara and nirvana, all phenomena that appear during the post-meditation sessions do so, as was previously explained. So they do that within the ability of not having any conception of things being this or that in terms of having some inherent existence. Now, again, I'm going to share this comment from Buddha Nature. Again, the Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche, I think, is doing this commentary. I've got the Kindle on this. This is the annotation 42 from that book, which again is his direct commentary. He says, a bodhisattva who dwells on the 8th bhumi has attained the level of non-returning in that they will not fall back to a stage in which one perceives in terms of characteristics during the post-meditative phase. In other words, when you're up off your cushion after realizing emptiness, you lose, in a sense, the ability to distinguish things in terms of the way that you did prior to that, because you still had some concept of inherent existence that could potentially arise. Again, for the bodhisattvas, I don't think it arises so much, but nonetheless, let me talk about it once we finish this. It says, such a bodhisattva has completely abandoned the conceptual elaboration, consisting of the perception of objects in terms of their characteristics, such as this is a flower, this is white, this is red, and so on. I don't think he means to take this literally as the fact that they can't discriminate things being white, red, dark blue, whatever. I think what he means is that you no longer have kind of the conceptual elaboration that is establishing things as having their own identity, which again is the things that you've gotten rid of when you've gotten rid of all the afflictive obscurations. Many of you have read the Vajra Cutter Sutra, Diamond Cutter Sutra, and there's a whole lot of references to the same sort of logic in there, right? The bodhisattva shouldn't perceive themselves as a bodhisattva. The arhat doesn't perceive themselves as an arhat. When you've attained freedom from the afflictive obscurations, you don't have those sorts of conceptions. Though you can hold an awareness that all these merely imputed phenomena are there, you don't have the conceptions that kind of go along with that would distinguish this and that and what have you. Are we getting some more buzzing on this? Maybe they can't hear it. Maybe it was just where the microphone is, though, Stephen. Let's go a little bit longer and see what happens. Oh, okay. We'll exchange it. Okay, we're getting a buzz here in the Delta, so we're changing the microphones. So again, I'm not exactly clear on all the intricacies of this explanation, but it seems like if you have attained essentially what is the state of an arhat, a foe destroyer. Bodhisattva has that level of realization at this point when they're on the pure grounds. You don't have, there are still things appearing as if they're inherently existent. Remember, that's what the knowledge obscurations do. They cause everything to seem like it has its own entity, like it's established from its own side. But there's no longer kind of a conceptual designation with that of like, you know, and it doesn't mean that you can't delineate and say this is this, that is that in a real sort of just matter of fact way. But it just means that you don't get into adhering to those things as having their identity in that way. You see them as merely imputed. Things have a subjective kind of nominal existence as opposed to an objective existence from their own side, even though they're appearing that way. Again, for the pure ground bodhisattvas, they would not buy into that appearance in the least. So I think that's all that it's referring to. Remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago about elaboration. Without elaboration, you have different ways of describing elaboration, and the most frequent way is without the conceptual elaboration of holding things to be inherently existent. You know, without that thought pattern arising. And for the bodhisattva who's at this level, sorry, that's all gone, right? You don't have any of that anymore. Okay. But, you know, they still obviously do have that appearance, or else they wouldn't need to abandon the afflictive or the knowledge obscurations. Sorry. It's the knowledge obscurations that cause that false appearance. Let's continue. There's a little bit more left of this section. On the top of the next page, again, at this point, we're up to page 153. The line, dwelling constantly in absorption in the meditative stabilization of total pacification, and that we saw, does not refer to an uninterrupted continuation of a single meditative equipoise, because a direct and unobstructed mental placement upon suchness, while at the same time directly realizing conventional phenomena and teaching sentient beings, is only possible for a Buddha. I explained that, you know, previously. We're not saying that the bodhisattvas at this stage are in meditative equipoise all the time and are teaching other sentient beings. That's only possible for a Buddha. They alternate back and forth between these two. But they're able to go into that meditative equipoise, you know, very easily. They don't have any real obstructions to doing that. And eventually, through the force of the accumulation of merit, they're able to move, you know, through the knowledge obscurations and go on to the 9th ground and go on to the 10th ground and eventually go on to buddhahood. It means, therefore, that having completely dispelled forced striving, it is no great effort for these bodhisattvas to enter a meditative equipoise on suchness. And during the post-meditation sessions, it is not possible for all activities not to be held by the essence or core of that mental placement upon the direct realization of suchness. In other words, they bring that awareness of emptiness into their actions off the cushion. And of course, they have the ability to go into those meditative equipoises, really quite, you know, very, very little effort, very subtle effort. And then, of course, this is what I mentioned earlier. It is the thinking of the commentary that we should infer that the 9th and 10th level bodhisattvas also possess these qualities. Even though we've been focusing mostly on the 8th ground bodhisattva, those in the 9th and the 10th bhumis are also included in this category, other than those that are in the last two categories. Again, the qualities of those obstructed by one life. This is divided into two parts. The causes of the complete perfection of enlightened activities, which has two parts, the causes of effortless enlightened activity and the knowledge of appropriate enlightened activity for the sake of disciples. So verse 73, wait, I'm sorry, but let's go back to the charts. Bodhisattvas on the 2nd through 7th. I missed that one. Sorry. Let me get these now, though, before we get too far into this. They're untainted, although dwelling in the world. This was verse 70. Just as a lotus remains untainted by the contaminations in the water from which it grows, so does the bodhisattva on the 2nd through 7th levels engage in activity for sentient beings in samsara without being stained by the phenomena of the world. And then the third one that we just went through, bodhisattvas on the 8th and 9th. And again, we can include 10th ground bodhisattvas up till they're having one life left, and then on the final life. Their minds blaze like fire regarding their work for the welfare of others, and they are constantly absorbed in meditative equipoise on the pacification of all elaborations. Okay, so then let's go back to, let me put that there for when I come back. Let's go back to this section. Again, we were starting this, verse 73. By the propelling power of prayers, and because of being separated from all conceptuality, in order to ripen sentient beings, they do not need to employ effort. Because of the power of their previously planted intentions, referring to coarse or obvious striving, in which they prayed that they would be able to effortlessly and spontaneously work for the good of sentient beings, and because they are divorced from all conceptuality of apprehending the true existence of phenomena, again, that's for all of them on the pure grounds, the bodhisattvas obstructed by only one life can spontaneously engage in working to ripen living beings by teachings and so forth, without any great effort of motivation. It is true that holding to the true existence of phenomena is an obscuration by affliction and is therefore abandoned on the 8th level, like I just said. But here, any manifest striving for the motivation for teaching the Dharma has been removed, and they naturally engage in effortless work for the welfare of others. Now, again, is this the same effortlessness that we see as a quality of the Dharmakaya? You know, remember when we talked about the Buddha jewel back many, many classes ago, there were 8 qualities of the Buddha jewel, and the second one was effortlessness. You know, they essentially have this ability to spontaneously do whatever is required to benefit all beings, right? We would say that there still is maybe, again, some subtle effort, but it's the big difference is that a Buddha can do this through the force of having their mind in meditative equipoise on emptiness while knowing all phenomena and being able to benefit all beings from that space. Whereas the bodhisattvas on the 10th ground and this one and the next one still are blocked from having that full ability. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem like it requires much effort at all in terms of being able to benefit other beings. So they're actually very powerful beings at that level. And then in terms of the knowledge of appropriate and enlightened activity for the sake of disciples, this is verse 174. They know precisely by whatever appearance and with which method each student needs to be tamed, whether by teaching, by displaying a form body here isn't the Rupakaya that a Buddha has, because they don't have a form body yet, per se. They do have ability to manifest forms, by conduct or by deeds. So there are all these different ways that they can engage in activity for the sake of disciples, and they do have some awareness of how to do that. They don't have, again, the perfect knowledge of a Buddha that allows them to be able to, work for all beings perfectly. We're getting the sound in the compa again a little bit, but I think we'll be able to get through without that being a problem. So it says here in the commentary, whether it be by teaching, as illustrated by the actual oral teaching of Dharma in accordance with the disciple, by form bodies referring to the expression of various and numerous manifestations or form bodies. Again, they're not technically a form body of a Buddha, a Rupakaya, but they are nonetheless manifestations, physical manifestations of the mind of the 10th ground Bodhisattva at this stage. Again, in accordance with the disciple. Again, they can appear in the form that is best suited to help that being. By conduct, referring to the expression of acts of desire in order to tame those with desire. By behavior, such as acts of coming or going. So whether it be any of these bodhisattvas engage in the welfare of others, knowing by which method and in which form disciples will be tamed. So again, there is still something that distinguishes them from Buddhas, but they are doing an awful lot. They're not there yet, though. They haven't actually attained everything that a Buddha has. Again, that's why we're comparing them to Buddhas in this, showing their impurity. Yes, they have all this purity that they've attained compared to lower level bodhisattvas, compared to ordinary beings and so on, but they still don't have what a Buddha has in terms of the abilities. The second part of this B, that previous one had 2 parts. This is the second part, effortlessly engaging in enlightened activities, relying on those methods. In this way, for living beings filling the limits of space, the intelligent ones always work perfectly, enacting spontaneously and without obstruction the welfare of sentient beings. So in this way, meaning relying on those methods that we discussed, and for living beings limitless as space, these intelligent bodhisattvas work perfectly for the sake of sentient beings at all times, spontaneously, without any great effort. And because there exists no possibility of being hindered by obstructive circumstance, without impedance. There's nothing impeding them from doing this. They simply are able to, through the force of their development, to be able to teach other beings and so on. Again, I wouldn't say that they have the complete effortless quality of the Buddhas yet. I think the other thing that always, when I went through this, that I was thinking about, that I was going, we often say that it's only a Buddha's mind that knows the full intricacies of karma. So even if this bodhisattva who's at this level is able to teach others in accord with their predispositions and appears in a form that is suitable to them based on their own minds and so on, they have that knowledge because they've developed these clairvoyances perfectly to be able to do that. But they don't have the full knowledge of all the karma of that being. And so they really can't help beings to the greater degree that a Buddha can. Otherwise, we'd just maybe all stop and hang out at the 10th ground. I mean, what would be the point of going on to achieve that? There seems to be a huge abyss between even the next category we're going to discuss, the bodhisattvas in their last life, and Buddhas. The qualities are immense in terms of a Buddha compared to even that bodhisattva that's in their last life. So let's go back to our chart and discuss this bodhisattva. This is, again, bodhisattvas on the 10th ground, causes of the complete, again, and we would say they're on the 10th ground, but with one life remaining. They're in the penultimate life, again, in samsara. First, they have the causes of the complete perfection of enlightened activities. They work spontaneously for the welfare of others without any coarse effort of motivation due to their previous striving and complete abandonment of the conception of true existence. And they tame disciples by whatever method is suitable for each. And that was verse 74. But then in the second part, they effortlessly engage in those activities at all times for all beings as infinite as space, spontaneously and without hindrance. And unlike the Buddha, they cannot simultaneously remain in meditative equipoise on suchness and act for others' welfare. Unlike the Buddhas, they also need to apply subtle motivational effort for their activities. So again, we're going to see this in verse 77 when we look at the bodhisattva on that next one. Pure and impure qualities of the last life bodhisattva. All right. So here we have the pure aspect and the impure aspect. These are the two divisions of this section. Verse 76. This mode of the bodhisattvas in post-meditation sessions is renowned in the world as being equal to the Tathagatas by way of perfectly liberating sentient beings. This way of working for the welfare of sentient beings, Gyaltsab says, by the last life bodhisattva in the post-meditation sessions, such as his activities of teaching Dharma, for example, is understood in the world to be equal with the Tathagata in truly liberating sentient beings. Mention of the term post-meditation sessions means that in these sessions, in terms of the numbers, etc., of sentient beings he teaches, and in terms of the enlightened activities, his ability to help all beings is equal to that of the Tathagata. However, there is not equality in all respects, because the ability to maintain meditative equipoise directly upon suchness while teaching sentient beings at the same time cannot be achieved by anyone other than the perfectly enlightened Buddhas. This means that the same mind that directly sees phenomena as they are ultimately also sees phenomena as they are ultimately also sees phenomena as they are conventionally. Again, the Buddhas no longer have any obscurations to seeing the two truths simultaneously. And this requires the total extinction of the contamination of holding the two truths as separate entities. So again, this is just delineating that they've got this amazing ability, but they don't quite have it yet. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be at this level, obviously, but I mean, if you still have to go toggle back and forth between meditative equipoise and emptiness, and then your post-meditation sessions in what we call subsequent attainment, then it seems that you would be blocked to some degree to helping others when you're in your meditative equipoise. I mean, what happens to your emanations that you are producing while you're in meditative equipoise? I don't know. It's an interesting thought to kind of consider, because while you're in meditative equipoise, you can't be knowing conventionalities, right? Because you have still just one mind, even though you might have many different manifestations of that mind and can engage with other beings from that point of view of the mind being able to benefit them and knowing their minds and so on. You still have only one continuum, one mental continuum. I don't know. It's interesting. Is there not yet a Buddha where they can hold their mind in meditative equipoise and emptiness, and all of those activities can arise with the sphere of that? So anyway, can't say again that I've seen perfect descriptions of all of this and what happens at that stage. So then we have verse 77, which talks about the impure aspect, again, compared to a Buddha. It is true to say that the difference between the earth and a speck of dust, and between the great ocean and the water and the hoofprint of an ox, is the difference between a Buddha and a Bodhisattva. So as I was saying earlier, there's still like this huge gap between the qualities of this very high level Bodhisattva and a Buddha. Gyaltsab says, although it is true to say that there is equality in terms of the numbers of disciples to whom the Dharma is taught and so forth, in all other respects, there's no equality. Because whatever difference there is between the mighty earth and a speck of dust, and between the great ocean and the tiny puddle made by the hoofprint of an ox, so there is a similar difference between the perfect Buddha and a last life Bodhisattva. Therefore, the previous verse speaks of the equality in terms of the numbers of disciples these bodhisattvas actively work for in the post-meditation sessions. Whereas this verse points out distinctions in general terms, such as the manner in which their activities are carried out. Okay. This is necessary because of the differences between the removal and non-removal of all motivational effort in the activities of body, speech, and mind, again, that a Buddha would have, that even high-level bodhisattvas still require some subtle effort, and between the ability and non-ability to remain in meditative equipoise upon suchness, while at the same time performing activities, such as teaching the Dharma. So again, it would seem that that inability to be able to do those things simultaneously, the bodhisattva at this level would still be contending with. They still would be unable to benefit others while they're in meditative equipoise on emptiness. To say that the difference refers to an equality in terms of working for ordinary beings, but to an inequality in terms of working for those who have become Arya beings is not appropriate, because it is in the teaching, it is in the leading to nirvana of ordinary beings that the ocean and the hoofprint distinction is made. I think this is just basically saying that don't think that there's some delineation about it's equal in regard to ordinary beings, but not equal in regard to Arya beings that you're helping. You know, you're helping all beings. It's a regard to helping all beings to attain the nirvana, to attain not just the nirvana that's personal liberation, but even non-abiding nirvana. Okay, so I'm going to skip the commentary that goes to page 156, the next page, and that begins our section, immutable during the pure state, totally pure state. So we don't have time for this tonight. I was being ambitious and thinking I might get to it. So I did put one question on the homework or discussion questions that had to do with that. That's the second question there. So we'll have to entertain that question at the next time that we get together, which, by the way, we won't have any class at all the next 2 Thursdays. So the next class is 3 weeks from tonight, which I believe must be September 21st, I think is the date. So just know that don't come in on Zoom, because there's not going to be anyone there in the Zoom room. I'll be teaching I'll be heading to New York to teach on next Thursday, and then I'll be teaching in Raleigh after that. So, okay, so this is the question I want you to discuss, and I'll take some questions before we do this, but this is in regard to this section of the text that pertains to the second of the 3 states. Again, that state is that's both impure and pure, not impure completely, not pure completely. What is the meaning of the name of this state? I mean, again, we went through that tonight at the very beginning. What does Gyaltsab identify as the 8 causes of bodhisattvas taking rebirth in samsara? Which again is part of their impurity, the ability that they have to kind of be still somewhat impure compared to Buddhas, but also have a purity in regard to compared to ordinary beings or lower level bodhisattvas. And what are the 5 Arya bodhisattvas discussed in regard to the immutability of the Buddha essence during this second state? In brief, how are the qualities of each of those 5 set out? Again, you don't have to go into great detail, just mostly what was on the chart. Let me go ahead and finish the chart, having said that. Bodhisattvas in the last life on the 10th ground, their activities in liberating others are equal to a Buddha's in post-meditation. And that concludes that part of the chart. All we have left then is the immutability during the completely pure state, which again is what we'll start with next time. So are there any questions from tonight, either online? And by the way, if you do have a question, I think Shayla may have mentioned to you, put it in the chat box, and I'll check the chat box right now to see if there are. No, it doesn't look like there are. Yes, Stephen.
Okay, Don, thanks for taking my question tonight. This has to do with verse 172.
Okay.
I mean, you explained it, but I'm not sure I 100% got it. And it has to do, so it says, this is for the non-returner, so the 8th ground bodhisattva. It's on page 152, and it's verse 172.
Okay.
And it says their mind constantly blazes like fire. They permanently abide in equipoise within the concentration of the absorption of pacification. Are we saying, well, they still have subsequent attainment, but are we saying is because it's so easy for them to drop into meditative equipoise, that's what they mean there? Or is it because they have the lack of conceptual elaboration? Is it a combination of the both? I didn't quite get why they say that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's absolutely clear in terms of the commentary either, as to the full intent. It seems that, again, we can talk about those bodhisattvas at that level having this ability to enter into meditative equipoise quite easily, which again does allow for them to increase the strength of their realization of emptiness and to continue to remove the knowledge obscurations, again, provided that the requisite amount of merit is there. That's why, again, they need the time and subsequent attainment to continue to engage in the other perfections, to continue to benefit other beings so that they acquire the merit that will allow them to do both, requisite amount of merit, level of realization of emptiness that allows them to remove the coarser level of the knowledge obscurations, and then they remove the medium level, and then they finally remove the subtle level and they become a Buddha. But it does seem like also, again, that the power of that is stronger because of the non-conceptualization, the lack of conceptual elaboration when they're off the cushion. So again, I guess it's just getting to the fact that the bodhisattva's mind at this point is very powerful because you no longer have anything that's kind of keeping you from having that sort of immediate insight and an ability to work on removing the knowledge obscurations. When you're out of meditative equipoise in the impure grounds, I guess, again, because you still have the potential for conceptualization. I don't know that your conceptualization really arises that frequently. And we talked about that a bit last week, right? In terms of very previously, that it doesn't seem like there's that much opportunity for these sorts of things to occur within the Arya Bodhisattva. They have a total disbelief in the way things appear because of their direct realization of emptiness. But yet Aryas have that same wisdom. Arya hearers and solitary realizers have that same wisdom, and they still would potentially engage in conceptualizing things as inherently existent. So just as I think it's kind of speaking about, again, they've removed that level of impurity at that stage so that it strengthens their ability to maintain meditative equipoise and go into it quite easily. And that's how I'm gathering what they're talking about in this. But I don't know if that explains it then.
Well, what's interesting is I think that ability actually manifests on the 7th ground, if I'm recalling correctly from illuminating the intent.
Yeah. When we talk about the absorption of cessation that occurs on the 6th ground, even, I think is where it happens, where you can kind of go into that state very easily of the wisdom realizing emptiness. But again, at that point, you still haven't removed all the afflictive obscurations. So I guess there's a different ability that happens when you've entered into the pure grounds, because you no longer have anything that would give rise to any sort of conceptuality. Were you going to say something, Lou? Or?
So it says, during the post-meditation sessions, it is not possible for all activities not to be held by the essence or core of that mental placement upon a direct realization of substance. That the direct, it imbues the mind with suchness that it's impossible for it not to have any effect on whatever they're doing.
Right. So again, I think that the idea is that it's not that they are in that meditative equipoise while they're engaging those activities, but they have the influence of that is causing them again to no longer have any conceptual grasping at things as inherently existent, to have a sort of a mind that's freed from all of that, that is then engaging in kind of pure activities. You wouldn't have any of the faults that might occur prior to that. Let me do a little bit of reading again. I read through all of Geshe Jangpo Gyaltsen's. His commentary is quite good, and I think that he's may have some additional comments on here, but he also didn't really say too much that I was picking up when I read it earlier today. But let me take a look at that while you all are discussing and see if I can add any more at the end. Any other comments or questions? Anyone online? Okay, so let's go ahead then. We've got some time left. I have 37 minutes after the hour, so if we can talk for maybe about till about 5 minutes too, and then we can see if there are any comments or questions from your discussion. All right? Okay, so have fun discussing. In answer to Stephen's question earlier, I did go back to look at Geshe Jangpo Gyaltsen's commentary, and he doesn't really say much more. In commenting on verse 72, he says, the bodhisattva who is a non-returner goes to complete enlightenment with no return. It is irreversible. This is the bodhisattva from the 8th bhumi on, and includes the 9th and 10th bhumis. His power is so strong that when he works for others, it is like a blaze of fire. From the 8th bhumi onwards, the afflictive obstructions have been abandoned, and gross effort is no longer required to work for the sake of others. Before the 8th bhumi, a stronger effort was still required. The effort now is less strong and more subtle, but there is some effort required. Only a Buddha works for sentient beings effortlessly. The text says the bodhisattva is constantly abiding in meditative absorption, but constantly is not to be taken literally. The only one who is always in meditative absorption and who, from within that meditative absorption, works for all sentient beings is a Buddha. The bodhisattva needs to get out of meditative absorption or placement, and in post-meditation will work for the sake of others. In post-meditation, their actions are still infused with that meditative absorption, and its power is still there. They have complete mastery over the non-conceptual exalted wisdom realizing emptiness. They have this complete control and can use it for whatever they want. This is one of the 10 powers of a Buddha's omniscience that's usually mentioned in the Abhidharma texts. Anyway, and it doesn't really, it goes on, comment a little more, but it doesn't really talk about anything else that is pertaining to the question. So he doesn't really get into explaining all of it and what's happening with this ability. So are there any questions on anything else from tonight, from discussion or? Yeah, Sean.
Was it?
I don't know, we can't hear you, that's right. Can you put it in the chat box or?
Sure.
Because we don't have the ability here in the Gompa now. There's some glitch in the system. So I think if I put my speaker on my computer, then it causes a little feedback loop or something. So I don't know. Oh, messages there. Sorry. Let's go to new messages. Just as a reminder, what level of bodhisattva no longer takes rebirth by karma and afflictions? Is it the first level? Yes. It seems that once you become an Arya bodhisattva, all the way back at the first level, then at that point you no longer are taking rebirth under karma and delusions. You're taking rebirth through the force of compassion. So, yeah. Again, we wouldn't say that they've disempowered that karma and delusions. I mean, you haven't gotten rid of them, but the conditions aren't there for that to happen, because of your direct realization of emptiness, again, together with great compassion and bodhicitta. So, okay, if there aren't any other questions, then maybe we'll just conclude for tonight. It is 9 o'clock here on the Gompa, So again, we don't have class for the next 2 weeks, but feel free to use this time. If maybe you're going to Geshe Sherab's retreat, I hope you are, then you can join for that and enjoy that without any studying hanging over your head. But if you do have time to take a look at this and just see, again, we've gone through most of the first 9 presentations. We just have a little bit left talking about the pure state, which we'll do, and then we'll go on to the 10th presentation, which is indivisibility. Recall that all of these last few are all an extension of number 6, which is manifestation. So it's all about these 3 states and different qualities that we can talk about in regard to those 3 states from different vantage points. I find this one kind of interesting when you kind of compare it to some of the others. It doesn't hold together as well in some ways because it's mostly, in my mind, about the progress that the mind is going through as you're developing. It's more about developmental lineage than it is about naturally abiding lineage, even though the comment is made right at the beginning that it's the immutability of the mind, the nature of the mind as it goes through all this development. It seems to be focusing mainly on the development of the mind. Anyway, okay, let's do our prayers. Again, I've got this all in one file for tonight. I might mention, this is the chart that we were discussing this a little bit while we were doing discussion, because one of the versions of the charts that's out there doesn't have the first ground. It has the first ground lining up entirely with the path of seeing, and the second ground starting as soon as you enter the path of meditation. But anyway, I just thought I would mention that since it's up on the screen. But we've got kind of different versions of that floating around. One of them seems to be not quite correct. All right. So let's do the first dedication prayer here. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And then the long life prayer for His Holiness, followed by the prayer for Rinpoche's swift return. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the 3 jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And let's dedicate for any beings that we're holding in our hearts, those beings who we know or we know of their situation, that are experiencing great suffering, obstacles, illness, death, what have you. and send this positive energy out to them so they can be free from their suffering and find all the causes that will lead them to perfect peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings through what we have done here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. Again, hope you have a good couple of weeks, and I'll see you on September 21st.